In this beginner guide, I'll take you from sprue to finished miniature, covering everything you need to paint your first model. Let's start with the assembly. To remove the pieces from the sprue, simply follow the numbered instructions included with the kit, and cut them out using a pair of clippers. I began my hobby journey with an old wire cutter I had lying around at home, before eventually upgrading to a proper hobby clipper, so don't feel like you need expensive tools right away. There isn't a lot of science involved when it comes to cutting the pieces out, but you'll often hear two different recommendations. Some hobbyists suggest placing the flat side of the clippers against the model to get the cleanest possible cut. Others recommend leaving a small amount of sprue attached to the piece, in order to avoid accidentally cutting into the model and damaging any details. Personally, I prefer leaving behind a little bit of the sprue. It makes the cuts easier to see as I move on to the next cleaning step, and for that, a hobby knife is the tool you'll want. Although until very recently, I had been using a simple box cutter as a budget alternative. When using a knife, try not to apply too much pressure. Instead, work away at the excess plastic with several light cuts. If you try to remove a large section all at once and force the blade through the plastic, that's when slips and injuries are most likely to happen. Since my recent hobby haul from Japan, I have also been using a pair of dedicated finishing clippers. These are designed for removing very small amounts of plastic at a time, but they cut through them almost effortlessly and leave behind a much cleaner surface. With that done, the model is technically ready to be glued together. However, there are still a couple of optional cleanup steps worth talking about. The first one, in my opinion, is not optional at all, and that is removing mold lines. Mold lines are thin raised lines left behind during the manufacturing process where the two halves of the mold met. They can usually be removed very easily by gently scraping them with the back edge of your hobby knife. I consider this step important because those lines become surprisingly visible once paint is applied. This is especially true when using beginner-friendly techniques, such as washes and dry brushing, which naturally emphasize the textures and raise details on a model. The second cleanup step is sanding. This mainly applies to the areas where the sprue was connected to the model. For smaller Warhammer miniatures, sanding is usually not necessary at all, and the hobby knife will often do a perfectly good job on its own. I mainly reserve sanding for large flat surfaces, or rounded areas where imperfections tend to be more noticeable. When it comes to gluing the pieces together, there are two common options. The first is superglue, which will work on almost anything and is what I've been personally using for most of my hobby life. The second is plastic cement. Unlike superglue, plastic cement only works on plastic models, but it actually softens the plastic and fuses the two pieces together. This creates a stronger bond and makes the model less likely to break apart if it falls from the table. As a quick bonus tip, you can also use small amount of plastic cement along the seams and joints to help smooth them out. It can even soften rough areas left behind from cleanup, and help make the model look like a single solid piece. From here, you may want to glue the model to the base before painting. Doing so makes the miniature much easier to hold, especially if you're using a painting handle. While you're at it, this is a good opportunity to add some basing materials. Since this is a guide for beginners, dirt, sand and small rocks from the garden will work perfectly well. I personally bake mine in the oven for around 30 minutes beforehand, just to make sure to kill any bacteria. I recommend gluing the model to the base first, and then applying your PVA glue and basing materials around it. It might seem easier to finish the base first and attach the model afterwards, but doing so can sometimes make the miniature look like it's floating on top of the terrain rather than standing naturally within it. And with that, our miniature is assembled and ready for the next step. But if you're looking to get your first hobby tools, or upgrade the ones you already have, I'd recommend taking a look at JP Fans. They act as a shopping agent that allows international customers to buy directly from Japanese websites and online marketplaces that normally don't offer overseas shipping. Japan produces some of the best hobby tools, and many of them can be difficult to find locally or end up costing significantly more depending on where you live. So if there is a particular brand or product you've been wanting to try, I'll leave a link in the description below for you to check out. Now, gluing the model to the base this early can make some of the lower areas a little harder to reach. But before we start applying any paint, we first need to prime the miniature. Primer gives our paints a surface they can properly grip onto. Painting directly over bare plastic can cause the paint to rub off more easily, and it can also make it harder to control as it tends to slide around the surface. I can't personally speak much about spray can primers since I have never used them myself. However, there are plenty of excellent primers available that can be applied either through an airbrush or with a regular brush. But if you're starting on a budget like I did, there is another option. 3 years ago, when I painted my Leviathan box, I simply used black craft paint. Grab a large brush and apply it over the entire miniature, making sure the paint doesn't pool in the recesses. Any buildup of paint can begin to obscure the details. That makes the miniature look good in the first place. As for primer color, I will almost always recommend black for beginners. The reason is simple. Miniatures often have small areas that are difficult to reach with a brush, and if you have already glued the model to the base, there will usually be a few places that become even harder to access. With a black undercoat, those missed spots simply read as deep shadows. Most people will never notice them, and it allows you to focus your attention on the areas that actually matter. Now it's finally time to put some paint on the model. There are 2 things worth talking about: the tools we'll be using and the different ways we can approach a miniature. Let's begin with the tools. When it comes to painting, the 3 essentials are your palette, your brushes, and your paints. Of those 3, I would argue that a wet palette is one of the most useful purchases a beginner can make. Unlike a dry palette, a wet palette keeps your paint workable for much longer, which means you won't constantly have to refresh them while painting. And when you're just starting out, being able to take your time without worrying about your paint drying out makes the entire process far more enjoyable. If you are on a budget, don't worry. There are plenty of tutorials online showing how to make a homemade wet palette, and I personally used one for over a year when I first got into the hobby. When it comes to brushes, a basic set of synthetic brushes is more than enough for your first few models. Over time, however, those brushes will begin to lose their point, making detail work much more difficult. Because of that, I recommend eventually picking up a single natural hair brush to act as your dedicated detail brush. And despite what many beginners assume, it doesn't need to be tiny. A quality size 2 brush can comfortably handle almost every detail you'll encounter on a standard miniature. The important part is taking care of it. Avoid using your good brush for heavy jobs like dry brushing, mixing paint, or large-scale base coating. That is what cheaper synthetic brushes are for. Finally, we have paints. If possible, I strongly recommend using paints specifically designed for miniature painting. Can you paint miniatures with craft paints? Absolutely. In fact, that's exactly how I painted many of my first models. But hobby paints tend to have a better coverage, smoother consistency, and generally make the learning process much easier. And when you're already trying to learn brush control, thinning paints, and color placement, removing a few unnecessary frustrations can make a big difference. One thing beginners often don't realize is that the paints you'll need depend entirely on the model you are painting and the techniques you are planning to use. For example, an orc like this one requires a fairly wide range of colors. We have skin, leather, cloth, metal, teeth, and various small details. A Space Marine, on the other hand, can often be painted using little more than the main armor color and a handful of supporting colors. The same applies to painting techniques. Some miniatures can look fantastic with nothing more than a base coat, a wash, and a dry brush. This skeleton is a perfect example. A bone color base coat, followed by a brown wash and a light dry brush, is often enough to create an excellent result. As you can see, different models require different investments of both time and paint. And this is usually the point where others would share their ultimate method for painting every miniature. But honestly, I don't think such a method exists. There are countless techniques, shortcuts, and approaches in this hobby. Some are designed for speed, others prioritize quality, and some are simply fun to experiment with. My recommendation is to explore different methods and find the ones that excite you the most, because enjoying the process is what will keep you painting long enough to improve. For today though, we're going to stick with what I like to think of as the classic approach. We will begin by base coating each part of the model. If you have ever colored in a coloring book, the idea is very similar. Our goal is simply to give each area its corresponding color, while trying to stay within the lines. So that means painting the skin green, the gun metallic, the teeth an off-white, and so on. And above all, take your time. Don't worry if you make mistakes. Painting tiny details is difficult for someone at first, and improving simply comes with practice. Now, before we go any further, there is one habit that's worth learning from your very first miniature. As we've already seen, miniatures are covered in tiny details, and thick paint can easily fill them in. Adding just a small amount of water allows the paint to flow much more smoothly from your brush, while preserving all of the sculpted detail. The trade-off, of course, is that each coat covers a little less. But that is exactly why you often hear the phrase, "two thin coats are better than one thick coat." Although it may take a little longer, the finished result ends up looking much smoother. Paint consistency is one of the most important skills in miniature painting. So, if you'd like a more in-depth explanation, I have an entire video dedicated to it linked above and in the description. With our base colors finished, it is time to start giving the miniature some more depth. And fortunately, this is where things become much easier. The simplest way for a beginner to do that is with a wash. A wash is simply very thin paint designed to flow into the recesses of a miniature, naturally creating shadows and separating one surface from another. You'll find washes in many different colors, but if you're just getting started, black and brown are by far the two most useful ones. And later on, once you're a bit more comfortable, you can even begin making your own simply by thinning regular acrylic paints. That said, washes aren't the right answer for every miniature. They work best on models with lots of texture and deep recesses. This orc is a great example. The teeth and the equipment, for example, all give the wash plenty of places to settle. A Space Marine, on the other hand, is made up of large smooth armor panels. Instead of flowing neatly into recesses, a wash often dries in blotches and leaves behind unwanted stains. So, what do we do in those cases? Well, this introduces another useful beginner technique. Whenever a wash isn't the best option, we can simply create our shadows ourselves. Instead of starting with a bright color, begin with a slightly darker one. Then, once that's dry, apply your lighter color again, but only over the raised area. Unlike our base coat, a single coat is usually enough here. And if you are feeling confident, repeat the process once more on an even smaller area. This is called layering, and it is one of the most versatile techniques in miniature painting. With nothing more than careful brush placement, you can paint almost any material or surface. And with the miniature finished, there is just one last thing left to do: the base. For this one, I simply painted the ground brown, the rocks gray, and then finished everything off with a quick dry brush using a lighter color. Dry brushing works by removing almost all the paint from your brush, before gently dragging it across the surface. Because there is so little paint left, it only catches the raised details, making textures like dirt, rock, fur, chainmail, or even hair stand out almost effortlessly. This is another one of those techniques that's incredibly beginner-friendly. I didn't find much use for it on the miniature itself, but for a simple base like this, it's hard to beat. And just like layering or washes is another tool worth having in your toolbox. Now, this video wasn't about creating the best possible paint job. It was about getting your very first miniature on the table. Along the way, we've looked at some of the most useful beginner techniques, but we've only scratched the surface. Over the next few videos, we'll be taking each of these techniques and exploring them in much more depth, one step at a time, so you can continue building your skills without having to learn everything at once. If you don't want to miss those, consider subscribing to the channel. And if there is a particular technique you'd like to see me cover first, let me know down in the comments below. I'll be reading through them as I plan the next videos in this series. Finally, if you're looking to pick up some Japanese hobby tools for your own projects, don't forget to check out JP Fans through the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.